Last week, we talked about Luke and his Old Testament stories that he retold in new ways to be able to connect Jesus' birth with the Old Testament. This week, we're going to see how another gospel writer named Matthew does the same thing, but not to connect the promises of the Old Testament, but to connect the figure of the Old Testament to Jesus. And that figure is Moses. We read in Luke this week in our Sunday message from Luke chapter 6, and it was called the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. In Matthew, it's called the Sermon on the Mount because it gives a very specific set of instructions as to how Jesus sits and gives this message and where he sits. And all these little clues that he puts in are cluing us in to something Matthew is trying to make us understand. That Jesus isn't just a new prophet in the line of a bunch of other ones, but that he is replacing this figure. He's fulfilling the Old Testament role of prophet in a new and complete way. So you see, for us today, Moses is just another figure, isn't he? Most of us don't think a whole lot about him. He's just one of many figures in the Old Testament that we see story after story about, don't we? And we think, man, it was great that God used Moses to part the Red Sea and to lead the people out of Egypt. But beyond that, we don't really understand how he figures into Israel's history. But for those of the Jewish faith, particularly in Jesus' day, Moses was central to their faith. He wasn't just a big figure in their day. It was central to what they believed and how they believed it. He was the great prophet. He was the lawgiver. He was the chosen representative of God to the people. The law that he passed on would be the foundation for which the whole nation of Israel was built. He would be the Jewish equivalent of our founding fathers here in America, but with an added component, because obviously our founding fathers are our spiritual leaders. They were men who just happened to found the nation we live in. But for the Jewish faith, Moses was the one who stepped in, spoke for God, and formed and fashioned how the nation would run and operate. He was just central. You couldn't get away from Moses if you were a Jew. He was the pinnacle of the whole law, the whole nation, everything. Now, Matthew wants his Jewish readers and us to see Jesus as this new Moses. He wants to clarify how God is calling his people to live in his new kingdom. Like Luke, Matthew, though, doesn't just come out and say, hey, Jesus is the new Moses, right? Pay attention. He's using a story, and he's using a setting. He's using a scene. He's painting a picture so that we who have read through the story so far can look back and say, oh, okay, I get it. This is how Jesus fulfills that role. So we want to look at Matthew 5, verse 1 and 2. That's all we're going to look at, just two little verses. Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, to see how Matthew puts this all together for us. So in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1, he says, seeing the crowds, he, being Jesus, went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. Verse 2 says, and he opened his mouth and taught them. Key part. You're thinking, man, only 2 verses. This is just setting the scene. No big deal. We really need to focus on what Jesus says, not what he did. But this is where we need to key in on not only how he talks and what he does and what he says, but the actions. Everything he did had meaning. All right? It wasn't meaningless. It was full of meaning. And so Matthew is showing us how this breaks down to show us what Jesus as the new Moses looks like. You see, the first words in Matthew's prologue to what is called the Sermon on the Mount, because he's on a mountain, already brings to mind that image of Moses, doesn't it? If you remember back in our Old Testament story, we talked about how Moses was on Mount Sinai, right? And the people were gathered around the base of the mountain. And what did Moses do? He went up the mountain to talk to God, didn't he? The words, he went up on the mountain in the Old Testament is an exact word-for-word quote of 19:3. So Matthew 5 takes Exodus 19:3 and just transposes it. Matthew's saying, here, pay attention. This is Moses. This is a new Moses, right? When you read Exodus 19, you see Moses described as ascending Mount Sinai to receive the law. And as others have noted, that phrase only occurs 3 times in all of the Old Testament, rather. In each of those times, it was in reference to Moses climbing the mountain of Sinai. Next, Matthew describes the mountain that Jesus is on as the mountain Now, there were plenty of mountains in Israel at the time of Jesus. It could have been any number of mountains, right? So why does Matthew describe it as the mountain? Well, here in 5:1, we have no mention of a mountain prior to Jesus moving up on it, so we know it's not like, okay, he's talking about a particular mountain that's really special in that region. No. He's just trying to make us understand that as Moses climbed the mountain, Jesus is climbing the mountain to give a new law for a new people, right? Third thing he does here, Matthew describes Jesus as sitting down to teach. This is meant to bring to mind Moses' stance, his physical stance, as he received God's law. Just as Moses went up the mountain and sat down to receive the law, Jesus sits down to give the law to the people. Now, when you read through those things and you think through those three markers, you're thinking, whoa, that seems very subtle. We shouldn't really catch that, should we? Is that the point? And you might not at first, and that's okay. But for, again, Jewish readers who remember the story of Moses and the mountain and the law and the people, these all are clues to say, this is the one who fulfills it all. By linking Jesus to Moses, he's telling us through story pictures that he's completing that Old Testament picture, right? In doing so, he's showing the way for God's people in his new kingdom. It's a life that's not built, though, on a complicated religious system like Moses wound up giving to the people, but on a relationship directly with God that is moving not into the center of a camp or a community, but into our very hearts.